Okay, good evening, everybody. My name is Daniel Reinhold. I'm Dean of the Bernard Revel Graduate School of Jewish Studies, and it's our great pleasure this evening to be able to put on this special lecture for me to welcome Professor Shmuel Feiner. He's Professor of Modern Jewish History at Bar-Ilan University and Chairman of the Samuel Brown Chair for the History of the Jews in Germany at Bar-Ilan too. He's currently Chairman of the Historical Society of Israel and Editor of Tzion, a quarterly for research in Jewish history. Professor Feiner was Chairman of the Jerusalem Leo Baeck Institute, has been Vice President of the International Leo Baeck Institute, has been a visiting professor at Yale University and Frankfurt University, and was recipient of the Alexander von Humboldt Research Award 2012. Is the author of many works, including Haskalah and History, The Emergence of a Modern Jewish Historical Consciousness, first published in Hebrew in 1995, and then by the Lippmann Library in English in 2002, and The Jewish Enlightenment, again, first published in Hebrew in 2002, and then in English, University of Pennsylvania Press in 2004. And that work was winner of the Koret Jewish Book Award as well, and was subsequently also translated in German in 2007 and won the Meyer Struckmann Prize, Heinrich Heine Universität Düsseldorf. Also the author of Moses Mendelssohn, also Hebrew 2005, and translated into German and into English, as well as Chinese. And that's merely a selection. So for those of you here tonight and those of you watching at home, we welcome you. And Professor Feiner tonight will be speaking to us on the subject of the Jewish 18th century and the transformative year 1782. There will be time for questions at the end, should you have. Professor Feiner.
Toda rabba. Thank you very much. Shalom and good evening. It is a great pleasure to be here with you at the Yeshiva University, and I'm ashamed to say, for the first time ever. I see that there is a lot still for me to learn about this university. Hopefully I'll have more opportunities to do it. So thank you, Professor Daniel Reinhold and Professor Jacob Schechter, for the kind invitation. The 18th century was the first modern century in Jewish history. That's my statement for the beginning. The deep changes that took place in its course shaped the following generations, and many of its voices will reverberate today, still reverberate today. The twisting and fascinating biography of the 18th century from the viewpoint of the Jews emerges from paying sensitive attention to individual life stories, to bright and dark experiences, to voices of protest, and to aspiration for reform and personal and general happiness. This is the main idea behind my two volumes, Jewish 18th Century, a European Biography. The first is already published in 2020 by Indiana University Press, and the second, covering the second half of the 18th century, is forthcoming, and hopefully it will be published by April next week. And my talk today will highlight one particular year, 1782. If we look at the history of modern Jewish culture as a chessboard, then in 1782, most of the pieces were already laid out on the board. Trends that emerged decades earlier now matured and developed. In 1782, the various labels, the boundaries between the different groups, and the topics that ignited controversy and struggles were already fixed with greater clarity, and hopefully I'll be able to convince you this evening that this was the case. Robert Darnton told us the following: people often ask me, as a specialist in the field, would I like to have lived in the 18th century? First, I say, I would insist on being born well above the peasantry. Second, no toothaches, please. So I totally agree, but I would like to add a few other conditions. As a Jew, only in London, Amsterdam, or maybe even Newport, and preferably as a Sephardi wealthy male, such as the one that is depicted on the cover of the first volume, a Sephardic wealthy male, such as the one was painted by Hogarth and appears on this cover. The British historian Derek Beers argued that no period can outmatch the catalogue of fundamental changes that came to pass during the 18th century. Here you can see the 2 volumes in the Hebrew edition. And Charles Dickens described brilliantly the contradictory trends of the 18th century from the post-revolution perspective when he wrote those famous lines in The Tale of Two Cities. I'm sure that you all know it. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times, it was the age of wisdom, it was the age of foolishness, it was the epoch of belief, it was the epoch of incredulity. And it was the season of light, it was the season of darkness, it was the spring of hope, it was the winter of despair. We had everything before us, we had nothing before us. We were all going direct to heaven, we were all going direct the other way. And Reinhard Koselleck attributed particular significance and direction to this impression when he spoke of the century as the threshold, in his word, the Sattelzeit, over which the entire modern age emerged. While it is possible to identify deep historical changes in Europe and beyond from the beginning of the early modern period, awareness of the new age as a concept laden with values and aspirations, as an epoch in which accelerated and unprecedented processes were taking place, directed toward an open future, did not arise until the 18th century. The people of that century experienced the transition at varying degrees of intensity, and spokesmen for the Enlightenment believed in the absolutely innovative character of the age and desired for improvement and perfection. Toward the end of the century, several leaders of the Jewish Enlightenment movement, the Haskalah, came to share this mood. They proclaimed the advent of the modern age not only as an historical period distinctly better, but also and primarily as a welcome change in the path of humanity. They hoped that departure from the ways of thinking and political actions that had been prevalent until their time offered a chance for a dramatic improvement in the lot of the Jews, as expressed, for example, with great excitement and anticipation in the issue of the groundbreaking periodical HaMe'asef in 1786. Today, it says, every day, men of rare spirit and generous heart rise up to shatter the shackles of bitter exile for the benefit of the Jews and to do good for them. Of course, this optimistic view was merely partial and expressed a wish rather than an historical reality. The biography of the Jewish 18th century is rich in conflicts. The tension between the new era and the old one, with its opportunities and dangers, dreams and apprehensions, determined the course of its life. Those who sought religious revivalism confronted conservative opponents who suspected them of heresy, and those who designed plans for fundamental reform of, for example, education, confronted the rabbinical elite jealous of its authority. The outlines of the vision of a future for an improved and enlightened world, where reason and humanism would overcome barbarism, were mingled with the opposite picture of the world, painting reality in the gloomy colors of collapse. Struggles to remove the restrictions imposed on the Jewish minority in the name of tolerance met with suspicion regarding their inherently flawed character and their alien nature and the dangers that it posed. At the centers of ferment and tension in Europe, and particularly among the Jews, the power of modern autonomy was manifest. The identifying marks of the new self, of the individual who recognizes his or her own value, are visible in almost every one of the vehement disputes that arose in the public realm. The study of Jewish history, especially in Europe, usually treats communities, the growth of new movements, social issues, relations with Christian world, schools of thought, influential figures, books and movements. And it tends less toward the full reconstruction of an entire period. My idea, by contrast, is to present the period between 1700 and 1800 as an historical framework for retelling the history of the Jews in Europe. In 2 volumes, each covering half a century, in a chronological account in which the points of interest and the main axis are events and life stories in the region between England and Poland, Lithuania, but also the land of Israel and America, this book constructs a history of the century, traces its principal trends, and mainly offers broad scope for the observation and self-understanding of the people of the time. So today, I would like to highlight one particular year in the Jewish 18th century, the year 1782, and to study its meaning. It is an example taken from the 2nd volume and demonstrating the importance of delving deep into a single year in order to touch history as close as possible. And let's start with Moses Mendelssohn. The Jewish philosopher from Berlin was not a particularly optimistic person. He was rather dubious about what his contemporary Immanuel Kant, for example, regarded as a fundamental principle of the Enlightenment and the ethos of modernity: the ability of humans as rational beings to change, to reject prejudice, and to cast off the dependence on the representative of authority and tradition. Mendelssohn had little faith in the future in which the values of humanism, morality, and reason would guide man's behavior. He believed that under every stone, barbarism was waiting the chance to raise its head, to impose on man the shackles of religious coercion and civil oppression, to rob them of their dignity and to mock the optimistic dreams of the Enlightenment project. But in the winter of 1782, this skeptical philosopher was for a short while swept up with enthusiasm. In the first week of January, Nathan, the youngest son of Moses, and from it, Mendelssohn, was born and received into the family with great love and joy. Only 5 days earlier, the Edict of Tolerance, signed by the Emperor Joseph II, had been published in Vienna, arousing great hopes and expectations. And a few weeks later, at the end of January, Naftali Herz-Wesely, far-reaching program from the transformation of Jewish education, was printed in Berlin. So, thank kind Providence, Mendelssohn wrote, that I live to see yet in my old days the happy time when the rights of man are beginning to be taken to heart in their true extent. From his perspective, in the capital of Prussia, then under the rule of Frederick II, you witness the progress of several processes so historically significant that it seemed they might, after all, bring a revolutionary change. At this historical juncture, Mendelssohn observed with heightened curiosity. Both Lessing and Dom, he said, the former, a philosophical poet, the latter, a philosophical statement, conceived the grand aim of providence conjointly with the rights of man, and at the same time, an admirable monarch not only followed the same principles, but also formed a planned commensurable to his vast sphere of action, the carrying into execution of which seems to require more than human powers, and he is now setting to work. And he continues, I live in a country in which one of the wisest sovereigns that ever ruled over man made the arts and sciences flourish, and rational liberty of thinking becomes so universal that the effects thereof extended to the humblest inhabitant of his realm. Too optimistic when it compared with the reality. He was enthusiastic by his friend Lessing, not otherwise, the political reform plan of Christian Wilhelm von Dohm on the civil improvement of the Jews, and by Joseph II, Tolerance Patent, the Tolerance Addict that was published by the Emperor of the Habsburg Empire. However, Mendelssohn's epitime was relatively brief. When he read Johann David Michaelis' critique expressing the author's doubt the Jews were capable of integrating into the state, as Dohm has suggested, and arguing that their religion, problematic moral character, and faithfulness to the messianic vision of a return to the land of Israel would make it impossible to ever trust the Jews as royal citizens. This shook Mendelssohn's confidence in the likelihood of a change in traditional positions among the Christians. In early February 1782, when he read the full text of the Edict of Tolerance for the Jews of Vienna, he even began to doubt Joseph II's real intention. Nevertheless, the feeling that something was happening induced him to write a challenging, bold text, which was known as the Preface, the Vorrede to the German translation of Manasseh ben Israel Vindicia Judaeorum, 17th century apologetic work on Judaism of this rabbi from Amsterdam. It would be no exaggeration to describe the Preface as a radical text in which, for the first time, Mendelssohn set forth a vision for a new structure of Jewish life in the modern era, and called upon the rabbinical leadership to relinquish its authority. It was Dohm's revolutionary work that roused Mendelssohn to write the Preface. Dohm demanded that the state fundamentally change its attitude to the Jews, to the Jewish minority, and take responsibility for the transformation of the Jews. Now, Mendelssohn proclaimed with unconcealed emotion, the problem of the anomalous existence of the Jews is becoming a test case for the viability of the ideas of the 18th century Enlightenment. The Enlightenment's campaign of religious intolerance is now also touching upon the future of the Jews. The discourse of religious polemics had been replaced by a discourse of human rights. He said in this preface, it is not the vindication of Judaism or the Jews either that he wants to write. He merely conducts the cause of mankind and defends the rights. And fortunate will it be for us if that cause become at once ours, if there be no such thing as urging the rights of mankind without at once claiming ours. The philosopher of the 18th century takes no notice of difference of dogmas and opinions. He beholds in man only. Sadly, however, this optimistic text of Mendelssohn's was immediately torn to shreds. The anonymous response by August Kranz, one of the cleverest spokesmen from the second rank of the German Enlightenment, shattered even the most modest of Mendelssohn's expectations. Kranz, who found in Mendelssohn's doctrine of tolerance a challenge to Judaism, stated that religious tolerance clashed with the Jewish religion and its commandments. He called upon the Jewish philosopher to acknowledge the contradiction and to deny his religion. On June 12, the anonymous article, The Search for Light and Justice, came out, and Manuscript learned that his support of religious tolerance was wrongly understood as a step towards conversion to Christianity. And if this were not enough, as soon as Manuscript wrote his preface, the persecution of his friend and neighbor, Vesely, began. In his Divrei Shalom ve'emet, Words of Peace and Truth, Vesely had criticized the traditional education and proposed that it be replaced by a modern Jewish school, a suggestion that aroused an organized protest by the rabbinical elite. Members of the German Enlightenment began to doubt the sincerity of Manuscript's Jewish identity, and the rabbinical circles began to suspect that Vesely was trying to undermine the foundations of the religion. On top of all this, another scandal that had raged in the north of Germany in the last month of 1782 and had angered Manuscript was still resonating. It was the excommunication by the rabbi of the Altona community, Rabbi Raphael Cohen, of a free-thinking, fashionable Jew called Nathanael Posner. His fashionable way of life and dress, a wig, an airbag, and braid, his clean-shaven face, his attendance at the theater and balls, and his wife's promenades with her women's friends in a carriage in the streets of the city were all regarded as an expression of free thought and contempt for religion worthy of punishment. When he openly expressed defiance in the Altona synagogue, saying that he didn't recognize the authority of the rabbis, and he said, actually declared, and it was documented, and he brought him to the Beit Din of the community, that the rabbis actually, what happened, they not just neglected the true meaning of the Torah, but the Torah had fallen into the hands of thieves, cheats, scoundrels, and lying interpreters. So he was threatened then with excommunication after few witnesses came and told the Beit Din of Raphael Cohen what he declared against the religion. The importance of the 1780s has not escaped the notice of historians, and they have devoted much attention to the two great stories of the decade: Joseph II's legislation as the introduction to the emancipation of European Jewry, and Vesely's proposal to reform Jewish education as the onset of the Haskalah. However, that transformative year was not only a milestone on the way to social emancipation and integration of German Jews, nor did it mark the end of one historical era, the early modern age, as David Ruderman argued. Rather, it brought to fruition dramatic historical processes that had begun at the turn of the 17th and 18th centuries. Without John Toland's 1714 essay on the granting of citizenship to the Jews of Britain, without Gotthold Ephraim Lessing's 1754 play, The Jews, and the 1753 debate in London about the Jew Bill, for example, it is difficult to understand Joseph II's Edict of Tolerance, and without the early Haskalah of Raphael Levi of Hanover, of Israel Zamoch, and Moses Mendelssohn, pioneering Hebrew periodical Kohelet Musar, it would be impossible to understand Isaac Euchel, the founder of the Haskalah movement, and its innovative periodical HaMe'asef. So, in 1782, just few facts, there were fewer than 2 million Jews in the entire world, about 3/4 of them in Europe. where the largest Jewish population lived in Poland, while fewer than 100,000 Jews were dispersed throughout the German state. And several intense processes occurred there. At the very time when faith in the supernatural was being subjected to the criticism of reason and various processes of secularization were accelerating, belief in magic was growing stronger. Religious leaders were gaining influence and prestige. The doctrine of Kabbalah was on the ascendancy, and its books were being widely distributed in numerous copies. Hasidism, a movement of religious revival and enthusiasm, was on the rise in Poland, Lithuania, and the polemic against it was being conducted in heated religious rhetoric. So it's not just about Germany, not just about enlightenment or emancipation. For example, when the advocates of the Haskalah were crossing the border from Poland to Germany, to the German state, to satisfy their desire for secular knowledge, in 1782, one of them, Yitzhak Halevi Satanov, crossed the border in the opposite direction and returned to Poland for a short time. Satanov was a prolific scholar who came to Berlin from Galicia and later managed the modern printing house, the Orientalische Buchdruckerei of the German Maskilim. There's a lot to say about this printing house, which was really the first modern place where modern, let's say, books could be published. And Satanov was his director. So Satanov arrived in 1782 in Koryt, in the Ukraine, where he established one of the great projects of Kabbalistic literature in the modern era. In 1782, he printed two manuscripts, Etz Chaim and Pri Etz Chaim, by Rabbi Chaim Vital, the disciple of Ha'ari. These works were printed with the agreement of Kabbalist circles from Brody in Austria and the participation of several close associates of the first Hasidic leader, the Baal Shem Tov. And they fostered the spread of the Kabbalah and the formation of Hasidism. The religious mission proposed by Etz Chaim books to the students was greatly inspiring. Not only did the mystical language instill religious life with a spiritual significance beyond the study of the Talmud, but men were called upon to play an influential role in a fascinating dialogue conducted between the upper and lower worlds. In 1782, the Koryt press also printed Safnat Pa'aneach, one of the first Hasidic books and the last of Rabbi Yaakov Yosef of Polnoi, who died that year. That book developed the doctrine of the tzaddik, which would become the basis for the legitimacy of Hasidic leadership. A separation was made in the book between the new religious elite with pretensions of being the wealthy leadership and the rabbinical leadership that met with total failure. For example, when Rabbi Yaakov Yosef of Polnoi wanted to show how corrupt the rabbinical elite was and how its members were pursuing wealth and departing from the true worship of God, he actually compared them to whores. And I brought it in the Hebrew and an English translation here. For he is like the whore who, when she lies with her husband, her thoughts stray to the foolish matters of the adulterers. Thus the students, while they study, commit adultery with the wealthy in their thought, and the wealthy commit adultery in every one of their negotiations, thinking those thoughts when they study Torah and pray. It is no wonder that this humiliating criticism infuriated the Mitnagdim, and the publication revived the fighting spirit, which had died down somewhat in the previous decade. So there was a second polemic against Hasidism in 1782. In Berlin, however, relatively little was known about what was happening among the Jews in the communities of the Ukraine and Lithuania. In fact, among the Berlin Maskilim, there was a growing tendency to cut themselves off from them, to make a border between East and West, the German Jews and the Polish Jews. It was the philosopher Solomon Minon who significantly contributed to the raising of a wall between the Jews of enlightened Germany and those of backward Poland. This is the definition. He himself underwent several cultural conversions in his lifetime. The first was very brief, when he became excited by what he first heard about Hasidism. The second was much longer and brought him to the philosophy of the Enlightenment. After he immigrated to Germany, he became one of the harshest critics of Polish Jewry. In 1782, Maimon was in Berlin, and there, as he noted in his revealing autobiography, he experienced a spiritual rejuvenation. At the very same time, when Satanov was leaving Berlin for the Ukraine to print books in Kabbalah, Maimon arrived in Berlin, where he read the works of Leibniz, Locke, and Spinoza, and he developed into a free thinker who did not hesitate to write and express his skeptical ideas. Maimon met Moses Mendelssohn, and the relationship was one of mutual respect. Mendelssohn encouraged him and was very surprised that a Polish Jew who had only a glimpse of Wolff's metaphysics understood it in such depth that enabled him to question his conclusions. In Berlin and Königsberg, the two main centers of the emerging Jewish Enlightenment, a cultural revolution was then already on its way. Three formative texts, I mentioned two of them already, Divrei Shalom ve'emet by Naftali Erz-Vezeli, printed in January of 1782, Mendelssohn Preface, written in March, and Nachal HaBsor, which announced in December the founding of the Jewish Enlightenment movement, provide an insight into the importance of 1782 as a transformative year. 1782 ended with Nachal HaBsor, signed by the founders of the Jewish Enlightenment movement, Chevrat Dorshei Leshon Ever, headed by Isaac Euchel, a young maskil from Copenhagen who was then a student of Immanuel Kant, and he actually was the author of Nachal HaBsor. It was a declaration of independence of the movement, which was first founded as a local circle in Königsberg, Prussia, in December 11, 1782. After 2 generations of early maskilim, the Haskalah grew to maturity, and that slim pamphlet heralded the establishment of the modern Jewish literary republic. In an effort to separate the existing religious models from the new model of the periodical HaMe'asef, the line was drawn between the religious literature for which the rabbinical elite was responsible and the modern, non-religious literature that the maskilic elite was promoting. The new periodical intended to create a modern network of communication linking the maskilim and enhancing their ability to exert influence. This was a mobilizing document that proclaimed the opening of the movement's ranks to anyone interested in joining and contributing to cultural renaissance. It's a very interesting pamphlet. It's actually a call to subscribe to HaMe'asef, and I believe that this is one of the fundamental documents in modern Jewish culture. But this was not the only perspective on the meaning of this year. In 1782, Rabbi Yehuda Leib Magaliot, the rabbi of the Buznau community, followed all these events and texts from afar. When in Königsberg, Euchel outlined the program of the Haskalah movement, Magaliot published in Poland his book of science, Or Olam, Al Chokhmat Ateva. He was only a few years older than Euchel and already tended to regard Haskalah favorably. But this book could hardly be part of the Haskalah project. Magaliot was attracted to the sciences, and like early Maskilim at the start of the century, was aware that the wisdom of science had been neglected in Jewish culture and wanted to remedy this shortcoming. But his book conveys a double message. His nearly erotic passion for science is restrained due to his deep fear that modernity might have destructive consequences. For him too, 1782 was a transformative year, but its significance was different. He decided then to halt at the entrance of the Haskalah, to withdraw for the early Haskalah as well, and to become a resolute opponent to Moses Mendelssohn, whom he knew and admired. Mendelssohn's Preface set off an alarm for him. While Mendelssohn advocated a Judaism that rejected religious coercion, Magaliot believed that coercion was one of the fundamentals of Jewish religion. While Mendelssohn opposed Dohm's proposal that the Jewish community ought to continue maintaining the right to punish those who strayed from religious norms, Magaliot supported Dohm's position. And when Mendelssohn proposed that a distinction should be made between universal religious beliefs and those beliefs specific to Judaism, Magaliot argued that such a division has no basis in the Jewish religion and only encourages heresy and religious permissiveness. While Nachal Absor voiced an optimistic expectation that the gates of knowledge would be opened, Magaliot sensed an oncoming crisis and foresaw an utterly bleak future for the Talmud learning. And he said the following, actually shouted the following: "Where are my brothers? In the past I knew them, and they were the choicest young men, but the study of philosophy has turned them into haters of the Torah and its scholars. My heart mourns for those who lost their way, and today there is no one who can rescue them from their abandonment." So in the 1782, the various labels, the boundaries between the different groups and the topics that ignited controversy and struggles were already fixed with greater clarity. The Mitnagdim were able to identify the Hasidim. The rabbis could single out the Maskilim and the freethinkers, and the Germans could spot the Poles. And the evaluation of the time the evaluations of the times were divided. When, for example, Rabbi Tzvi Hirsch Levin, the rabbi of the Berlin community, ran away from his home when the Vesely affair was at its height, abandoning the Berlin community, leaving a letter in which he identified those who held responsible for undermining the stability, saying that some new men have arrived who have found allies to vilify the religion. His son, a rabbi in his own right, but also a supporter of the Enlightenment project, defended the proposal for modernizing the Jewish education and subverted the authority of the rabbinical elite, of which he and his family were an integral part. For a moment, the family was disintegrating. And where was Moses Mendelssohn at the end of that turbulent year? Over a period of several months, he went from feelings of enthusiasm and hope to the anguish, fear that it would be impossible to overcome barbarism. From the perspective of the end of 1782, reviewing his happy time as no more than a fleeting meteor, he said this following: "Now and then, a dot blazes up in the midst of the great mass, becomes a glittering star, and traverses as an orbit which now after a shorter, now after a longer period, brings it back again to its starting point, or not far from it. So, actually, very pessimistic perspective on his time, and Mendelssohn, as we know, did not believe in progress, which was one of the fundamental values of the Enlightenment in his time. So, would we like to live in the 18th century? Today, more than ever, I would say that I would like to take some part, at least in the dreams and great expectations from a better life for humanity. And I'm going to finish with some strong words of one of Moses Mendelssohn's last letters. It was 1784, not 1782, where his dreams and nightmares are mixed. And he said the following, very, I think, contrary to the image we usually have of Mendelssohn as an optimistic and believer in the values of modernity and enlightenment. We dreamt of nothing but the Enlightenment and believed that the light of reason would so intensely illuminate the environment that delusions and enthusiastic fanaticism could no longer be seen. But as we can see, from the other side of the horizon, nighttime, with all of its ghosts and demons, is already falling. More frightening than anything is that evil is so active and potent. Delusion and fanaticism are acting, while reason contents itself with talk. So thank you for joining me this evening for this journey to 1782, 240 years ago, and hopefully this complicated picture of only 1 year can give you at least a sample of the entire project of writing a biography of the Jewish 18th century. Toda rabba. Thank you.